what we've been trying to do today is expand models that actually reproduce the financial crisis we've been in, compared to neoclassical models that completely failed to see it coming. This is one of my favourite quotes from the OECD about what the future was going to hold in June of 2007. And it was based on their DSGE model. And of course, the same expectation was common to neoclassical economists. This is Ben Bernanke talking about this period where there was declining volatility in unemployment and inflation, declining levels of both as well, which they thought would go on forever. And of course, that isn't quite what happened. Instead, we had an explosion in unemployment and a collapse in inflation. And what I've added in there are the two factors they leave out: the level and the rate of change of debt. The level going up through the roof, as Matteo showed in the previous presentation, and the rate of change plunging when the crisis began, which is really what caused the crisis. But of course, what will we know? We don't know neoclassical economics, so we must be one, mustn't we? According to Krugman. Now, there's central factors in Minsky's hypothesis, and because of the amount of time, I'll flash through this section fairly rapidly, so my apologies to anybody who sees this on the web, but given the fact I've spent almost exhausted the time, I better go rather quickly for those in the room. So, of course, Minsky's been misinterpreted by neoclassicals. They really have no idea. They try to model them using an equilibrium approach without endogenous money or banks, and without aggregate debt actually mattering, all three of which I think Minsky explicitly contradicts himself. And he rejected the neoclassical model by, again, saying it can't generate instability. It leaves out all the elements of banking and stuff that the neoclassicals are still happy to assume away. And he said we've got to do it with a non-neoclassical approach, which is why I did my work. And again, as Matthias has shown today, disequilibrium is an essential part of the system. It doesn't. The whole idea of disequilibrium is something which is so peculiar to economics because no other discipline talks about it. Let's talk about dynamic modelling. And you would never model a dynamic structure by starting up where all the rates of change are zero. You don't choose initial conditions, which mean nothing happens. And then, because Minsky also talked about the instability of capitalism, meaning if you did get to equilibrium, you'd be driven away. The whole idea that expectations would then shift behaviour. And endogenous money being essential, I covered that last week and talked about why the endogenous creation of money is an important part of the model, because again, that's why changing debt actually matters to the macroeconomy. Again, confirmed by good empirical work by neoclassicals when they drop their theory and look at the data. And the aggregate demand is increased by the change in debt. This is something which I find very difficult to get through even to post-Keynesian economists. This is something which is a common theme in Minsky and Schumpeter, and yet it's not turning up in a lot of modern post-Keynesian macroeconomics, because if you read Minsky, and this is very explicit here, he says spending is going to be greater than income. Okay? Talking in a private economy sense, a growing economy says has to have aggregate demand greater than income. It's explicitly in Minsky, it's explicitly in Schumpeter. He says, therefore, for that to happen, to have a growing economy, you must also have growing debt, which again puts a bit of a realism on debt. Debt isn't all bad. We're talking about debt causing crises here, but debt also is what funds growth in the economy. And the important thing if you're going to have a policy approach is saying, let's get rid of the debt or minimise the debt that causes financial crises, and not maximise the debt, but make sure most debt that's created improves the economy's capacity to grow and to expand in technological capability. And Ponzi's are the key ones, again, as Matthias went through in the last half of his presentation. Ponzi finance is the key one that causes this instability. That's money borrowed to gamble on rising asset prices. And the financial sector, again, providing the money that lets Ponzi finance happen. So you've got a melding of macroeconomics and finance. You can't separate the two as neoclassicals do. And if you're going to be a genuine post-Keynesian in terms of working from Minsky's work, then you've got to have a theory of post-Keynesian economics, that is, a theory of economics and finance. Again, something which I don't think enough modern post-Keynesians are doing properly. So that's, I'm going to go through very quickly through these slides. I've done them a million times. And Matthias did a very good one-slide summary of the whole thing, so people in the room just take a look at each line. So I'm basically going through exactly the same process that Matthias went through. So a mathematician would be more parsimonious than somebody who works in the more literary areas. The boom's tending to bust, Ponzi's go bankrupt, down we go into a crash, etc., etc. And modelling that, of course, I've done the model which Matthias and Bernard went through. Now the question is, can we turn that into a modern monetary model? And that really requires, in linking that 1995 real sector model, where I had implicit money in the sense that debt was there, and debt was necessary to finance investment, but I didn't have the flows of money as part of the system. So that's the model specified in differential equations for when I had a four-sector version or a four-system version, the five-sector one that Matthias and Bernard showed a while ago, where the rate of change of government spending, government subsidy sort of collapses debt and government subsidy and taxation together. And combine that with the post-2006 model they've done, which were explicitly monetary but didn't have production. So you know that I've used this idea of a table approach of building the financial flows in a system. And that was just a strictly monetary model. There's no production going on there, in the sense that there's no explicit modelling of production. Of course, it has to be there. You wouldn't be hiring workers as you're going to get them to work in a factory. They wouldn't be giving you money unless they were consuming something your factory produced. So there's implicit production there. To make it explicit, you have two links. One is that wages determine employment, and that again determines output, and investment determines the capital stocks and therefore ultimately real output as well. So you have two elements in the table that have to be linked to give you a combined monetary and physical model. And the start of it was working out what wages are. That sounds like a ridiculous statement in some ways, but in the model I had which I showed last week, the money that hires workers is just a flow out of the capitalist bank accounts. And I'm now going to show that in the Minsky program, which probably the first one I've actually shown it live. This is this dynamic monetary modelling tool that I've been developing with the help of a grant from INET. And I just hope this gets recorded when I bring it up on the screen. Let's see. Here we go. Because I think the software is actually capturing just the window that you see there rather than the whole damn screen, unfortunately. But it is a dynamic modelling tool that lets me use a table like the one you see there and build a model of both the monetary flows and the physical flows. So I've embedded that in the presentation here. Let's just bring it up and show it. So it's got the Godley table idea, and I've now done a double entry consistent version here of the simple model I showed last week. And that starts with an initial money stock of 100 million, 100 billion, whatever. And now that can be embedded in a system palette. So what I've now done is take that model and represent it in a flowcharting program. That's without the flowchart at the moment. So you can see over here I'm defining the amount of lending is some constant V times what's in the vol. And the interest charges, the banking sector charges the firm sector for the borrowed money is the rate of interest on loans times the amount of the outstanding loans and so on. So it's very simple to define a set of equations that way. I pulled my hair out trying to define these in VisSim when I first developed these models because it was just too complicated to get the flows right. Now everything's captured inside that bank icon. But notice here there's the annual wage bill down the bottom there. I've got that's running in that particular simulation of $207 million per annum out of an initial amount of money of $100 million as a loan, which points out the stock flow confusions that got in the way of post-Keynesian understandings for quite some time. So the flow of wages per annum is workers' monetary share and net output per annum. So to actually specify what wages are and tie it to a production system, I have to say how net output is divided up, because some goes to workers in wages, the rest goes to capitalists in profit. I've got to talk about the time dynamics. What's the rate of production per unit of time, where your time is measured in years, and how's output produced? So I've got to look at all those various elements to bring these together. And income shares are pretty straightforward. If you say that a certain percentage S goes to capitalists, then 1 minus S goes to workers. And what bankers get is a transfer. It's not a contribution to output, it's a transfer payment. And they make a profit on the spread between loan rates and deposit rates and the size of loans and so on. An essential part of time is how long does it take you to produce physical output, and then how long does it take you to sell it. And the best person on this was Marx, I think back in volume 2 of Capital, talking about the turnover of capital and saying that the productivity of capital is the duration of a phase of production multiplied by the number of times that occurs in 1 year. So he was quite conscious of the fact that a certain level of output or a certain level of money in would produce, we turn over several times in a year. he used a ridiculously high example in his own instance of money turning over, I think, 15 times in 1 year, which I think is far higher than, it's effectively the velocity of money, but also, which is also related to the physical length of time it takes you to produce output. So it partly depends on how long it takes you to take a bunch of inputs and produce outputs, widgets in, vehicles out, that sort of thing. And it's also how long it takes you to go from borrowing the money to buy the widgets to selling the money from the cars and getting your money back that way. So it's that overall time lag there. So let's call that turnover period tau S. S relating to surplus, how long to take you to go from M to M plus. And call the capitalist share of output S. Well, then workers are going to get 1 minus S. And so that I'm using a simple little constant in that model I showed you a moment ago, W, for the rate of flow of money out of capitalist accounts to hire workers. So the flow of wages is W times whatever's in the firm's deposit account to begin with. So just using this elaboration that wages actually represent the worker share of output and the rate of turnover of output, then W is 1 minus the worker share divided by the time lag in production, or time lag in generating the surplus. So wages, I can now replace that W with that expressions, which relates it both to the income shares and to the time it takes to produce output. Now we get onto output. Well, you start with saying, let's just say there's a single, looking at a corn economy model, Q is output, and there's labour input. If you have constant labour productivity, then output's going to be labour productivity times how many workers you've hired. A very incredibly simple bare bones system just to start working. And I'm going to imagine a constant money wage, again just to work out what the inflation and price levels are. Now to link that to the physical model, I've got to have a price level. So I need a dynamic equation for prices, and I'm going to start with prices in equilibrium. And this is just as a way of deriving the overall expression. So if you were in equilibrium, then what you'd have is the flow of demand to purchase goods in monetary terms would be just equal to the flow of goods being produced by the factories at that same time. So your flow of physical output is going to be the quantity of output produced, which is labour productivity times labour, and where the labour, the amount of workers you're going to have, is going to be equal to the flow of wages divided by the wage rate. So the flow of wages I've already worked out is 1 minus S over tau S multiplied by the amount of money in the firm's deposit account. And just again elaborating each of those bits and pieces, there's 1 minus S, there's the time lag, there's the balance in the firm's deposit account. That's the flow of wages. So the number of workers is going to be that flow of wages divided by the wage rate. So I can now substitute that for L. And physical output is labour employed multiplied by labour productivity per worker. So I can now say that Q is going to be equal to A times L, but also substituting what L is for, A times the expression which now involves the amount of money in the firm's deposit account and wages. Now physical demand is going to be the amount of money spent in the economy over a year, and that's divided by the price level. The monetary flow of demand is the sum of what workers spend and what capitalists spend, and since you're spending 1 minus S of something and S of something, it all comes out to being F, the amount of money in the firm's deposit account, divided by the turnover period. So I can now do some cancellations here, but there's physical demand is going to be that turnover divided by the price level. So I've now brought the price level into the operation. And when it's in equilibrium, the flow of supply in physical terms will equal the flow of demand in physical terms. So there's equilibrium physical demand, and there's equilibrium physical supply. And now an expression that involves price in both those equations. And this is something which is quite remarkable for me because I had no expectation at this point. In fact, I began in deriving the price equation by starting by saying, I hate to do it when I'm going to presume neoclassical style supply equals demand. So I've got flow of supply equal to flow of demand, and I just fed it into the system. And then later I thought, well, can I work out a closed form for this? They were identical. And what's really, to me, quite intriguing, they were identical and equal to the expression which Raffa and Koleski have given us for markup pricing. So there's the overall expression for equilibrium price. Because I do some cancellation there, those cancel. Let's go back again, pardon me. So the tau's cancel, the FD's cancel. There's my overall expression. I rearrange it, and what's equilibrium price? It's 1 over 1 minus S multiplied by the monetary wage divided by physical labour productivity. And that's Koleski's markup pricing equation, effectively. So there is no conflict between neoclassical and post-Keynesian pricing in the sense that if you're in equilibrium, they're identical. The difference is that neoclassicals believe you actually are in equilibrium all the time. Because we're not, so you need a dynamic equation for that. So starting from that equilibrium arrangement, markup price, the money wage per worker, etc. What you're saying out of this is prices are converting a physical surplus into a monetary one. Which again is a very simple link between physical models of the production that the post-Keynesian and Marxists have done for a long time with this monetary system I'm trying to build. And a dynamic equation that's consistent with that is simply to talk about prices converging at equilibrium with a time lag. And we generally know that time lag in price setting at the aggregate level tends to be something like about a year. So there's the rate of change of prices, there's a time lag function of the convergence to equilibrium. So with that all done, I can now put together a physical model. So I've got output being labour productivity times labour, labour being this flow of wages divided by the wage rate, and the rate of change of prices being set up there. And I attach that physical system to the monetary one, and I've got a monetary physical circuit model. So it's the circuit model, but it's not yet Minsky. And to bring in, that's what it looks like when I simulated Minsky, by the way, putting all the bits and pieces together. That's the price level down here. I always find flowchart equation systems look great until you do something which looks better with an equation. And that's a mess. But that dog's breakfast down there is the price equation I showed you earlier. And very easy to tie together and simulate. It's not a difficult task at all compared to, say, using Simulink or XCOS and so on. So I've combined the circuit ideas about the nature of money with dynamic modelling, and I've got a real circular flow that actually is now a complete circular flow model. Now I'm going to do a bit of explanation. This is pretty much passe for people in this room, but explaining where the parameters come from. Because what I used in that particular model is I had the value for the constant at which workers spend is 26. So rate of change of workers' spending is 26 times whatever in their current account. And bankers was only 1. And the fullest of values is over here for that simulation. The reason for those values is, well, interest rates are obvious. It's 5% for loans and 1% for deposits is okay. The rate of surplus and turnover are arbitrary, but they're generally close to what we actually find in terms of income shares when you feed them in. But omega and beta and the rate of repayment of loans and the rate of recirculation of existing money are inverse time constants. And again, we've been talking a lot about that in today's group. So it's just related to the slope of a function. That's the exponential decay function. So to save time for this group, I'll page through a bit. I hope I'm still capturing that equation. I've got a feeling I'm not capturing the screen anymore. Okay. Now, that all brings me back. Actually, pardon me just doing this. I better save what I'm recording here because the software's stuffed up. It was supposed to record the full screen and it's recording just a window. And I'll now start recording from here again. Now it's recording the whole screen. That's great. I wish I'd done that earlier. Okay, but to bring in variable wages, I had a fixed wage there before, and it's just a part of the derivation. To bring in variable wages, I've got to talk about the Phillips Curve. And this is something which I'd rather see mathematicians do a better job than economists have done so far, because this is a relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of change of money wages that's part of all economic models. Every economic model of any type has a relationship like that. But it's been massively misinterpreted because Phillips was actually an engineer. Came across to economics and was trying to use 1950s type versions of technology, which really means drawings of circuit diagrams, to teach economists about dynamics. And of course, being typical economists, they completely misunderstood him, called it hydraulic Keynesianism, but he's trying to bring in dynamics. And here's his argument about why you should. In the paper before the Phillips Curve, he said recommendations for stabilising aggregate production have been based on static models. He said, but that doesn't give you a firm basis for policy. For a start, the time path can be different to what you might think it would be. You spend your time in the time path rather than equilibrium. And secondly, you can't handle interaction of prices and interest rates, etc., etc. You need a general model. So you build a dynamic model like this. Be familiar to anybody inside this room. That little bit there is the level of demand. that bit there is the rate of change of prices. And as part of that, he hypothesised that there was some sort of non-linear relationship between capacity utilisation and the rate of change of prices. This is what he argued verbally. There's some level with the relation between the level of production and the rate of change of factor prices, which largely boiled down to wages. And that's the drawing he had. Having done the drawing, he then said, well, I might go and spend a weekend or so with a manual calculator, or I think it's an electric calculator, working out whether there is such data like that, using 19th century UK data. Now, after he did this, and he saw what economists did to it, he said if he'd known what they'd done, he would never have done this work. Okay? It was disastrous for how it affected economics. But he found a clear tendency for this rate of change of wages to relate it to the level of unemployment. And he fitted a simple log exponential function to it, because that's the best thing you could do with a manual calculator back in those days. There's the rate of change of money wages, that's the level of unemployment, and when he fitted it to the data, he got a fit like that. Those crosses there are the actual data points he fitted. Just he summarised ranges to those 7 points, fitted the curve, and then he said there are deviations here which might be due to wars, wage price spirals due to wars, and rising unemployment itself. Change in unemployment was also a factor in his overall thinking. He then fitted it to the data, and that's what the data fit looked like, and he had a couple of glaring exceptions there, but hey, maybe 1940 was due to war. Apart of that was down the bottom there. With the inflation during the First World War, the Trades Union Council of England negotiated cost of living adjustments in the aftermath of the war. And then the government went back on the gold standard and caused massive deflation, and the workers had to wear wage cuts. They'd already agreed to them. That's the one reason they didn't go anywhere near collective bargaining agreements like that for decades afterwards. And that's the Second World War. So it looked like it fitted the data pretty well. And of course, but unfortunately, they didn't latch onto the idea that it's just a component in a dynamic model. Instead, they got into this idea of a static trade-off. And Phillips, said, you can't do that effectively. But unfortunately, in writing his paper, he actually contributed directly to that misinterpretation by saying, if you kept aggregate demand at a level which we gave you stable product prices, then you'd have unemployment of 2.5%. And if you kept demand at a level where prices are stable, then you'd have unemployment of 5.5%. And that implied that menu trade-off. Now, people ignored the if here, which would involve an incredibly elaborate control system to stop the system economy moving away. Without that, you just get cycles. So they thought, oh, well, simple trade-off, that's all we need to do. No need to add any other controls inside there. So it became part of orthodox Keynesian economics, and because it broke down, for no bloody wonder, because we live in a dynamic system they did nothing about, so the feedbacks that made it unstable were already there, that discredited Keynesian economics. In many ways, as I said, Phil truly wish he hadn't done the work. But this relationship is common to all sorts of models, including neoclassical ones. So I'm bringing it back into the way that Phillips intended to do it. And I will go again, given our time levels, rapidly through this stuff, since I covered this last week with the same audience. This is again the financial table, so I divide my financial system from that. And I get a system of differential equations, which, just using the placeholders here, I've got the rate of change of the money involved as repayments minus loans, etc., etc. And I then make substitutions there, again using time lags to do the substitutions, which are variable time lags. And I use a simple nonlinear form largely because I don't want to get caught up in having behavioural functional forms that impose themselves on my dynamics. I'd rather have the dynamics come out of the model. And the key thing I'm looking at here in terms of modelling behaviour is that people extrapolate current conditions forward. This is one of Keynes's main insights about how we cope with uncertainty. Since we don't know the future, he says we assume the present is a much more serviceable guide to the future than a candid examination of past experience would show it to have been hitherto. We just extrapolate current conditions forward. And he said that's we largely ignore the prospects of future changes about the actual character of which we know nothing. Yeah? It's a simple little way of shifting from the neoclassical utility maximising vision of what we do with current information to how we handle uncertainty, which is a far more important element. And of course, again, I'm telling people in this room how to suck eggs, but the fact that I'm using nonlinear forms is not essential. The nonlinearities actually come out of the inherent nonlinearity in the system itself. For example, I'm multiplying the wage rate by the level of employment to get the wage bill. So I've got a quasi-quadratic turning up there, and that alone, with linear equations, I still get much the same dynamic. I just get unrealistic values. So these are the variables I put in. Again, for the reason of time, I'll just leave those in the paper to have a look at later. And those are the functional forms that come out of them. So I've got unemployment, the higher the wage rate, the higher the employment level, the more wages and workers demand. The higher the level of profit, the more investment occurs. The higher the rate of profit, the more slowly firms repay their debts, etc., etc. And I then use the full form that Phillips used of the rate of change of money wages now being a function of the employment rate, the rate of change of the employment rate, and the rate of inflation. All those three factors are part of his thinking. And the price equation as before, the same basic idea. And production system is a Goodwin model. So I've got the same Goodwin model built in now. I can tie the whole lot together. And what I get is a financial sector that's, again, I'd never wanted to try to explain those equations to anybody, but they simply drop out of the table, which is quite easy to explain. The price system down the bottom there, along with wages. Production system, which is a strict Goodwin model again, but now working in absolute values rather than ratios. Again, that'd be an interesting exercise to convert to ratios and see what I get. And then productivity and population growing exponentially. And when you simulate it, you get the Great Moderation followed by a Great Depression. There's, again, I seem to have incredible luck in picking parameter values that expose the trend I want to look at. You can't actually tell at the beginning here, this is a log plot of the level of output over time, and with the real output. What you've got is cycles for a while that diminish, and then you get to a certain point, all of a sudden it stops growing. And what's actually happening when you look at in terms of inflation and unemployment, you have a series of cycles, diminishing cycles in inflation and unemployment, and then suddenly all hell breaks loose. Explosion in debt level, collapse in the economy, a fall into massive deflation. I've got too much deflation in this particular model. But in a stylized sense, that's really what we've been through recently. So it's transferred from the physical model, which didn't have inflation in there, and therefore I couldn't really say I captured the Great Moderation, even though I made that guess back in '95. Now I've got the Great Moderation as well as the Great Depression turning up. And you get the basic insights from Minsky. Depressions can be generated by a free market economy, and the crisis will be preceded, quite possibly, by a period of apparent stabilisation if you're ignoring the debt level. And that's, of course, the key element. The neoclassical looking at that data saw stability until the crisis hit. That's just looking at inflation and unemployment now, and you can clearly see the sudden, to them, and inexplicable transition from the Great Moderation to the Great, or they're now calling the Lesser Depression. From a Minskian point of view, this is always going to happen. With again plotting that rate of change of debt, which is the brown line, you can see the volatility in the rate of change of debt there, up and down like a yo-yo, and then bang to negative territory, massively so. And the high and rising level of debt, which then turns down, we're always going to have a crisis from that point of view. And it's better, again, to see, I'd like to see some of the work you guys can do on this, looking at a phase diagram, because we began with the unemployment inflation being, let's see with the mess over here, that's 1980, and then this progression of what looked like a really lovely period of stabilisation until we hit the point where I changed to the blue line, and then bang, where the hell did this come from? Inexplicable in a two-dimensional phase diagram. But when you put the debt inside there, then it's pretty obvious what's going on. Rising level of debt, just a matter of time before that explosion occurred. Now, that's not as far as I've got, it's as far as I've managed to write up. What I've also done, and this is a very important stage for me to get to this point, is to bring in multi-sectoral production, because again, we're working with the abstraction of a single commodity economy, which we don't live in. So what I did was I simply took the basic idea of a table and then expanded it to multiple sectors. Again, that's only a small slice of the overall table. It should be three-dimensional. I've made it very wide, two-dimensional. And I've got capital goods sector, consumer goods, energy, agriculture in a notional sense in a four-sectoral economy. And what I get is a monstrous system like this, which has a set of 40 differential equations, 21 of which describe the financial system, the remaining describing the physical production system. It'll take a while to go through that one. I'll have to take you through slowly, Matthias. And what I get out of it is quite remarkable. I'll go through some of the components of it. Profit is now multi-sectoral, net of input. It's not just net of wages, it's also net of your inputs you need to produce your outputs. There's a different equation for each sector, of course, but the same structure. Each sector's model is a Goodwin cycle, so I've got the rate of change of capital stock, and this is now, I've got a lag convergence, the same sort of thing you were talking about earlier, Bernard, to lagged convergence of output to the capital stock, lagged conversions of output to the employment level as well, lagged conversions with prices too, and what I get out of it is something that, again, surprised me, because one thing John Blatt argued, and I really recommend any mathematician who's interested in this area to get a copy of John Blatt's Dynamic Economic Systems out of the library straight away, in talking about the innate instability in economics, which comes out of what economists call the dual stability problem, and what really is better expressed as the dual instability problem. And that is, if you have a multidimensional model of production, multi-sectoral, and you would look at the equilibrium, then either the equilibrium of quantity or price will be unstable, because they're both depending upon the mathematical or the stability properties of a semi-definite matrix, and one depends upon the matrix and the other the inverse. The eigenvalues are necessarily going to be greater than 0. One of them is therefore going to be greater than 1. You're going to get instability. And Blatt said, perhaps the instability we see in capitalism, the inherent instability, even above and beyond the financial system, is an unavoidable consequence of the local instability of balanced growth. And that's what I got when I simulated the model. 4 sectors, and that was the rate of profit across those 4 sectors. Instant limit cycle, which took me totally by surprise. I thought it would fail. And when I then did a weighted average, summing up the sectors using a price deflator, this also turned up completely unexpected. Galbraith's description of what the trade cycle is actually like in the real world is a beautiful one. It says it's not a wave-like motion, it's like a ripsaw. Okay? That's the rate of growth, looks like a ripsaw. And that's what I got. The blue line is the level of debt, the red line is the rate of economic growth. And what you get is this sudden plunge into a downturn, recovery slows down, accelerates again, back again. That is entirely the product of a set of interacting exponential behavioural functions plus the production system and finance. So there's no way you can say I've imposed that result with the behavioural shapes that I've chosen. It's partly something innate in the system. So, and you also notice in the financial system I have these cycles and the level of reserves and level of loans and deposits. So it all ties together, and all the references are there. Thank you. Yeah. Read 2. There you go. Yeah. Any questions?
You finished too early.
Pardon?
Too early.
Well,
you went fast.
You were
Sorry,
so
but
cruel and fast.
I'm sorry about that. My great sin of talking too quickly. It's partly I was aware of how we'd already gone over time, and I didn't want to have us hanging around too late. So,
but we do have questions. We have time for questions. So
yeah.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I guess it would be really nice to show 2 phenomena with inflation. One is then what the micro foundations people keep saying that it's what killed Keynesianism, which was stagflation.
Yeah.
So if you can have a regime here when that happens, you just throw the argument in the garbage, right?
Yeah.
And the other one is what we are seeing now, which is not quite deflation, right? Inflation is not going negative, but it's this sort of oscillation around 0 type of thing, which I understand can be explained just by saying that, yes, there are some workers that are getting a wage increase, but the majority are not getting any wage changes whatsoever. So it's not that there is wage decreases, because there is a steep downward sticky prices, wages. But I guess both phenomena can be accommodated in the model, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a rich range of potential behaviours, and it's just as complex as that. And the way they look at the stagflationary period is if you take a look at the data leading up to the stagflation, what you had was an absolute booming economy, but on an accelerating level of debt. And back in 1973, there was a debt bubble in both America and Australia, and I presume in other countries as well. Very, very distinct one in Australia. I actually showed the Australian data. There's an exponential rate of growth of the debt to GDP ratio, but there are two big pimples on it. One in 72 to 74, and the other from about 87 to 90. And that pimple, even though it's a much lower level of debt, is the fastest rate of growth of debt in post-war history for Australia's data. So that boom and then bust is what actually, to me, led to the classic Minskian situation of a debt crisis that many people don't want to invest. If you don't invest after a crisis, then of course the rate of growth is going to be low. But there was such a hyper boom beforehand that wages rose 17% in 1 year, and then at the same time you had OPEC coming through. So you had an inflationary surge from the very high level of capacity utilisation in the economy at the time, and then a debt crisis. So when you have that, of course, it takes time for inflation to be eroded out of the system. These things don't happen instantly. Only in a neoclassical fantasy world does anything happen instantly. So if you start with a high level of inflation coming out of a hyper boom, and you've got a high level of debt which has led to a crisis, then you're going to have a period where you have lower growth because the investment rates are very low, and high inflation. It's a fairly natural thing. It's only, again, like that lovely little quote on that painting downstairs, the Phillips Institute thing, often the biggest step in solving a problem is realising your understanding of the situation was wrong. Well, to try to shoehorn the real world into this thing where instantaneous adjustments occur is just nonsense.
Right.
But the reality is, if you started with a high level of inflation and you had a crisis, then you have a crisis with high inflation which slowly diminished over time, which is what we saw there.
Right.
The current situation, two things. First of all, compared to the Great Depression, government spending is far bigger than it was back then. We haven't actually put a general model in where there's government spending as well. But I like what you've done in your model. I didn't get a chance to discuss this earlier. But you've got a situation where if the government response is too small, you could still have a crisis even though there's a government response. When the government response is really big, then perhaps you can prevent that crisis occurring. Well, comparing now to the Great Depression, the government response has been far bigger and far faster. So that's partly why we're not seeing as much deflation. But if you look at the data, America went from a 5% rate of inflation to a 2% rate of deflation in about a year when the crisis first hit. And then the big stimulus package kicked in, and also Bernanke's quantitative easing zero, I think we have to call it. But the other factor too is the distribution of debt, because again we've got a very aggregated picture here, just the total private sector debt. When you look at the great 1930s, the business sector was in far more debt this time around. The non-financial business sector was in far more debt then than now, and therefore when the crisis hit, the response of businesses was, hell, if I don't sell my goods, I'm going to go bankrupt. So the response was slash prices and try to bring customers in through my door rather than the rival's door, and of course you both did it. Whole price level drops. You actually had a reduction in the amount of debt outstanding, but an increase in the debt to GDP ratio, which is one reason why, again, you can't just reduce it to ratios in general. It helps, but in that particular case, this spike in the debt to GDP ratio from 1930 to 1932, from 175% to about 240%, that was all at a time as falling private debt. Now this time around, it's not the businesses that are in debt so much. Back then, private sector business debt was about 125% of GDP. This time it's 70%. But last time, household debt was 25% of GDP. This time it's 100%. So rather than having businesses that have to cut their prices or think they have to avoid going bankrupt and therefore cause bankruptcy, this time we have businesses that are wondering where the hell are the customers? And they're not inflating prices all that much. But the customers aren't turning up with the customers in so much that they can't afford to shop.
So another question is related to that. So the real business cycles and rational expectations, people make a big song and dance about inflation expectations through the rational behavior that they will anticipate that this is going to be the response of the government, and then the agents. But in your model, that's not necessary to explain any of the dynamics. So inflation expectation doesn't play a role at all.
No, in fact, the whole idea of inflationary expectations in neoclassical models is endowing people with the individual capacity to accurately prophesise the future. And the best argument against that is their own performance of the financial crisis. On their own definition, they're all irrational.
Right.
So it's sheer nonsense, that bloody theory. But when people actually have done surveys and asked what people do base their behaviour on about inflation, it tends to be the experience of, not the expectations of. And so even on that sense, we are affected by current circumstances, and that was Keynes's essential point. The way we cope with uncertainty is by projecting current conditions forward. Even though, if we actually sat down and did the rational reasoning, we'd say, well, that's not going to happen. But what else do you do? There's a wonderful scene in any Star Trek fans here?
If you're not hardcore, but
not hardcore. Fair enough. You didn't see you walking inside in what do they call it? I think a Federation suit.
Yeah.
But there's one episode that the new generation has what Jean-Luc Picard is the captain, and Data is this humanoid, like a computer. There's human characteristics. And at one stage they're involved in some battle where Riker, I think his name is, goes off to be the competitor in a mock battle, and they try to work out what's going to happen. And Data says, oh well, Riker would normally do the following, but he knows that we know what he'd do, so he'd probably do the opposite. But he knows that we know that, therefore he would probably do the opposite of the opposite. And it goes on to about 5 iterations, and finally he comes and says, thank you, Mr. Data. In other words, this whole idea that you can do that forward extrapolation suffers for the problem of infinite regress. It's one of the travesties of logic that they got away with that garbage to begin with, and they're still spouting it. I went to the American Economic Association meeting in Denver earlier this year. Was it this year or the last year? Hang on, I get lost, but the one in Denver. And the 50th anniversary of rational expectations. And at the end of the whole nonsense eulogy, somebody asked, how do you think we've been modelling expectations in 50 years? And when it's, I think we'll still be using rational expectations. I think that's an extremely irrational expectation.
I'm not sure whether I'm correct or not, but isn't it that Phillips Curve, shouldn't it be backward bending a bit of? Because initially when rate of change of wages increases, employment increases, but after some point of time, although the wages are still increasing, but employment would start decreasing because people would start to hire those people. They would pay a lot of money, but to only those people who are capable enough. So although the wages are increasing, but the employment starts decreasing. Shouldn't it be backward?
But that is in the Goodwin cycle. There's a part of the cycle where wages are still increasing, but the employment is already decreasing. Remember in my graph there was wages here and employment here. So in this part of the cycle, the wages are still going up, but the
wages
employment...
will there or wages will there?
Well, it doesn't matter if you revert. There is always a part of the cycle. There's always a part of the cycle where when it's possible for both to go up together, both go down together, one go up and one go down.
That's one reason why it's so difficult for people to do this econometric idea of what they call first differencing and second differencing, and trying to find stationary series, because when you have a dynamic system, you often have a phase difference between two variables which are intimately linked to each other. And you can difference them to the cows come home. You're going to get points where one's going up, the other's going up, one's going down, one's going up. They're going to do all sorts of things, which an econometrician would say that they're not related to each other. In fact, they're causal. So in the Goodwin model, it's fundamentally a predator-prey system. And what you have in the predator-prey system, for example, is that the number of fish can be falling at one point and then start to rise while the shark numbers are still falling.
Yeah.
Okay? And then they both end up going in the same direction and then reverse again. So it's quite a common thing in a dynamic system, even without time lags.
So what you're saying is the value of the wages and employment, but it's the rate of change dependent on employment. So then it's the idea of the derivative of a function can turn negative before the function turns itself negative.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if it's relevant anyway, if the question. I want to talk about transparency because we model demand according to the information that people have, right? If there was less, I mean, is transparency considered there? Because, for example, if people didn't know, like lots of decisions would be made behind the scene, and people wouldn't know that much what is going up and down about the economy. Like Northern Rock, it happened because the Central Bank of England did not approve a loan. But then later on had to give lots of more money, you know?
Well,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In that stage, which was not public, if they would have done it in that stage without making this information go. Because I read in the history around 1930, which was the Depression, it started because of some bankers were talking in a restaurant, and they were giving all this information, you know, those kind of very sensitive information in that restaurant, which people heard about it.
Yeah.
This is a true story, but the book is written.
There's certainly, I mean, it's certainly true that information and secrecy and transparency all can play a factor in these sorts of dynamics. But often in a classical argument is that everybody knows everything, there's no problem. The reality is nobody ever does know everything, and even if people did know everything, there could still be a problem because in a complex system, you can't easily, you simply can't predict the future course of a complex system. That's, you know, we know the Lorentz problem there, that exponential decay of information means your forecast horizon is very narrow, even if you know the system properly, and even if it's a very simple system. In the real world, that's just, you know, impossible for people to say, oh, if I knew that information, I wouldn't have done this, which would mean there wouldn't have been a financial crisis. There would still have been a financial crisis. And actually, the Northern Rock one, I think there's an interesting analogy there. A friend of mine in the hedge fund world, the banking analyst, regularly goes on visits to banks to explore. He's looking for body language to work out what's happening. One day he found himself in Finland, and he was way up in sort of Lapland part of the world, and he was talking to the manager about the rates they're offering for deposits, which were really high. And he said, why have you got such high rates? So there's enormous competition for deposits here. And the guy said, well, who's your main competitor? And the bank manager in northern Finland answered Northern Rock. And he went, what? What is Northern Rock doing gathering deposits in Finland? So he said he got back to his office and they said, what did you learn in Finland? He said, I learned short Northern Rock. So it wasn't a case of what the Bank of England did, not approving loans and stuff like that. Northern Rock was already in serious trouble with its own liability structure from the bubble loans that had been offering in northern England, and the number of people who had been unable to pay the debt they'd gone into and so on. So they were trying their best to, you know, get cash in to balance their books, and were doing it by farming deposits from far away as Finland. Well, you know, it wasn't what the central bank did that brought them down, it was their own behaviour beforehand.
It was loans between banks which suddenly stopped.
Yeah, well,
they didn't trust each other.
Yeah.
But everything was hidden at that time.
That's what the thing is. The reality for a lot of those banks is that they were playing this game where if you were truly ethical about your behaviour, you would resign, because you knew you were lending to people who really were only going to be able to repay the debt. If house prices or share prices increased by some factor that you just thought was getting to be impossible to sustain, you're all doing it, and you know you're all doing it. And it's the old story, I think, that John Carney said once in one of his blogs. It's like a game of musical chairs. You can't stop because you think the game is silly. You've got to keep on running around the chairs. This is as soon as it's known, as soon as one organisation falls over, everybody runs for the chairs. The game is over. And with that, the reason the contagion is so important there is because the major source of funding is repo agreements. You sell and agree to repurchase back. But you know what you're selling is garbage. but you expect them to also reciprocate because you're buying their garbage back. But when the crisis hits, you suddenly think, hell, I know that I wouldn't trust my bonds to be worth what I claim they are in a crisis, so I'm not going to buy the other guys. And then suddenly, bang, the whole thing stops. And that appears to be what brought the system down, with the repo agreements just terminating almost instantly, and then all the clearance that is an essential part of the banking system operating properly stopped. And there's a similar thing as well, I'm trying to think, with Lehman Brothers, apparently. Lehman Brothers, apparently, the reason that was such a big crisis wasn't because they're, the size of the firm or anything else like that. It's that they apparently had cornered the market for commercial paper, because in the past, when the endogenous money theories were first developed by Basil Moore back in the 60s and 70s, firms would get their money for paying wages and buying materials and so on through lines of credit, like our credit cards. So they'd negotiate like a, say a big, General Motors might have negotiated $1 billion credit line with a line of credit with major banks. So if it had, say, $300 million in loans outstanding, they needed to pay an extra $400 million for a new agreement. It would just access the extra money. But because the banks don't like that area, because it doesn't make as much money as spending speculation, they've made the cost of lines of credit too high. So the response of the commercial companies, the non-banks now, was to start issuing commercial paper, which is a bit like a repo agreement. So they produce stuff with a 90-day turn rate. You buy a General Motors bill and give General Motors money, and then that was the source that General Motors got the money for paying its wages. Well, Lehman Brothers apparently cornered that market in all the transactions there. So when Lehman went down, the commercial paper system folded. And that meant suddenly companies like General Motors and Co. did not have money to pay wages a week later, which is why it was such a crucial crash.
So my last question. So you unified the two sides of your models, the endogenous money and then the real goodwill with the bank.
Yeah.
And then it became a very big system, which then it's obviously difficult to analyze. So I was thinking, if we were to ignore part of the internal dynamics of the endogenous money circuit, can we still have it connected to the other part, but through a few simplified variables? Can you sort of collapse some variables?
I think you can, because the most important financial one is the investment cycle. So you just basically take the other thing like payment of wages and so on as givens, and then measure wages by like a wages share of output and employment rate. Then you can probably simplify it that way.
Yeah.
But there's 6 equations. But again, it's just partly working in absolute terms rather than ratios. So working in absolute terms, the Goodwin model of 2 equations becomes, I think, 6 equations, but with 2 system states still, but 6 equations. Okay. So if you actually look at it that way, you can probably reduce it to, rather than the 14 equations that you've got there, down to about, say, 6 equations.
Right.
It's still fairly complex.
But now, with 6 you can start visualizing things, fix 3 and so on.
But what I think is actually going on is that when I had that cycle in the Goodwin model where you have the diminishing cycles in wages, share and employment, and then the explosion on the other side, that seems to have mapped through to cycles in unemployment and cycles in inflation. So it may be in some sense that it's like a transformation from one system space to another, where the inflation rate takes the place of wages share.
Okay. But I think it's worth investigating in those terms, sort of a stylized version of the financial sector, but then you still have the rest of the King model, but with inflation and...
Yeah, but you can probably map to from the physical model to the intermediate step by bringing in a price equation based on wages share.
Yeah.
You can probably do that, and that would then give you the extension of the monetary system.
And then try to see the sort of signature phenomena like stagflation.
Yeah.
Okay, that's something for people that want to do. Well, thank you everybody.